Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The city of Abadan woke each morning with the cry of hawkers, the roar of danfos, and the smell of roasted corn drifting through the air like a reminder that life was both hard and sweet. Inside this bustling world lived A.O. Daniels, a man who carried the burden of his work like a sack of stones strapped to his back. Each dawn found him hunched over his desk at a small but demanding firm, typing reports, drafting documents, and running errands that stretched him thin. His colleagues knew him as the one who rarely looked up from his files, the one who never joined them for long lunches or idle chatter. To them, he was focused. To himself, he was simply trying to survive. When the sun set, he left the noise of the office only to enter another kind of silence, the silence of an apartment that seemed to echo his exhaustion. Clothes sprawled across chairs like careless whispers of neglect. Plates were stacked in the sink, their greasy surfaces dull under the flickering bulb. On some nights, he would sigh so deeply it seemed the air itself bent under the weight of his fatigue, then collapse on his worn-out couch still in his office clothes. That couch became both his dining table and his bed, a witness to the quiet battles of a man too busy to live properly. A.O. often told himself he was not lazy, and indeed he wasn't. The truth was far simpler. His job left little room for anything else, and his body often betrayed him before his will could act. Cooking after such days felt like wrestling with shadows. Cleaning was a mountain he had no strength to climb. Laundry piled higher than he cared to notice until desperation pushed him to seek help. This was the pattern of his life, a cycle of work, exhaustion, and half-hearted survival that left no room for the things people called home. On evenings when his stomach growled too loudly to ignore, he relied on the voices of food vendors who called out their menus with such enthusiasm that one could almost believe they were offering love in a plate. He would call them on the phone, his voice clipped with weariness, ordering bowls of soup and packs of rice that arrived warm, but never comforting. He ate because hunger left him no choice, but with each spoonful, he felt a hollowness that food alone could not fill. The flavors were sharp, sometimes oily, sometimes bland, and always forgettable. He often found himself staring at the meals with the kind of suspicion reserved for strangers at a gate, yet he ate anyway, swallowing not just food but the quiet admission that his life had narrowed into work and survival. Occasionally, he muttered under his breath that he was wasting money, spending twice as much on meals that gave him half the satisfaction. But when a man is too tired to light a stove, he chooses the convenience of strangers cooking over the burden of his own. These vendors became part of his routine, faceless companions that fed his body but starved his spirit. Still, he pushed on, convincing himself that his hunger for companionship, for warmth, for care, was simply another luxury he could not afford. At the end of such nights, the city's noise would fade into the background, and A.O. would lie on his couch, the flicker of the television dancing on his weary face, his mind drifting between the ache of his bones and the emptiness of his apartment. If loneliness were a sound, it would be the echo of his spoon scraping the bottom of those plastic packs. And if it were a shadow, it would be the one that followed him from the office to his home, clinging tighter with every passing day. Every now and then, he tried to fight back against the untidiness, but his attempts were short-lived. He would pick up a shirt from the pile, only to realize 10 more waited behind it. He would scrub a single plate, then abandon the rest as if the sink itself had mocked his efforts. There were weekends when he promised himself change, when he planned to clean, cook, and reorganize his life. But by Saturday afternoon, his body demanded rest, and by Sunday evening, the looming workweek returned like a heavy storm cloud. In moments of frustration, he hired women from the neighborhood to help with laundry and cleaning, paying them enough to make the effort worth their while. These women came and went, each one leaving a temporary mark on his space before fading back into their own lives. To A.O., they were not companions, just necessary aids. Yet even in their presence, he could feel the reminder of his solitude, because once their work was done, the silence always returned. His apartment looked better after their visits, but it still lacked the essence of home. A clean floor could not chase away emptiness. A folded shirt could not soften the sting of loneliness. And though he had help, he was always aware that what he truly missed was not order but care, not neatness but a sense of belonging. This awareness was like a thorn lodged in his heart, sometimes dull, sometimes sharp, but always present. He carried it quietly, never speaking of it to anyone, not even to himself, except in the small sighs that escaped his lips at night. There were evenings when his exhaustion pressed down on him so heavily that even dialing the number of a food vendor felt like lifting a mountain. On those nights, hunger gnawed at him while he sat motionless, staring at the wall as if waiting for it to crack open and offer him a solution. The fridge held little more than bottles of water, a forgotten loaf of bread, and condiments that had outlived their purpose. He sometimes thought of cooking, imagined the rhythm of chopping onions, the hiss of oil in a pan, the smell of stew filling the air. But those thoughts dissolved as quickly as they came, crushed under the reality of his tired body. He would eventually settle for biscuits bought from the corner shop or nothing at all, convincing himself he would make up for it tomorrow. Tomorrow, however, always looked like today, demanding, draining, and unrelenting. Neighbors saw him as successful, always dressed in crisp shirts and polished shoes, leaving for work early and returning late. But behind the closed doors of his apartment, he was just a man wrestling with the ordinary weight of living, a man who had carved out survival but had lost touch with comfort. And though he did not know it yet, this quiet rhythm of loneliness and exhaustion was about to shift in a way he could never have predicted, set into motion by a chance conversation that began not with hunger, but with the simple act of ordering food. It happened on a restless afternoon when the sun was at its fiercest, streaming through the slanted blinds of Ao's apartment and lighting up the dust that hung lazily in the air. He had returned from work earlier than usual, his tie loosened and his face pale with the fatigue of a man whose strength was constantly being borrowed by obligations. His shirts lay in a heap on the floor, trousers folded carelessly across the arm of a chair, and the faint smell of sweat and detergent clung to the room like an unwelcome guest. On that particular day, he had invited a woman named Grace to assist with the laundry and general tidying up. She was not unfamiliar in his neighborhood, a quiet but dependable figure who moved from house to house offering her services for a modest fee. Grace carried herself with the poise of someone who had learned to survive storms without allowing them to drown her spirit. She bent over the wash basin, her arms moving rhythmically as she scrubbed, water splashing around her feet, yet her eyes occasionally drifted toward Ao. He was standing by the window with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking to one of his regular food vendors. His voice carried a mixture of irritation and resignation as he haggled over prices, asked what dishes were available, and complained faintly about how the meals never tasted quite right. Grace, listening quietly, bit back a smile. She had been washing long enough to notice his pattern, the long days, the short temper, the hurried calls for food that never truly satisfied him. She understood the picture before her, a man busy enough to afford convenience but too tired to realize he was being cheated by it. When he ended the call, tossing the phone onto the chair beside him, Grace straightened her back and wiped her hands on the cloth tied around her waist. She walked toward him with the kind of boldness that surprised him, because she had always appeared modest and soft-spoken before. "Olga," she began, her voice light but steady, "instead of spending all that money on food from outside, why don't you let me cook for you? I promise you won't regret it." Ao blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. He tilted his head slightly, his brow furrowed with doubt, as if she had proposed something dangerous. "Cook for me?" he asked slowly, almost tasting the words. "Do you even know how to cook the kind of food I eat?" His skepticism was laced with habit. Years of eating strange-tasting meals had made him suspicious of anything new. Grace laughed, a sound that spilled out like warm broth from a pot. She folded her arms and leaned slightly forward, her eyes sparkling with both confidence and amusement. "Olga, I can cook. In fact, cooking is part of my story. Years ago, I worked in a restaurant where people used to line up for my jollof rice and pepper soup. That's where I met my husband. After he tasted my food, he never allowed me rest until he made me his wife." She said it with a mix of pride and nostalgia, though there was a shadow of something unspoken in her tone. Ao chuckled, the corners of his lips twitching despite himself. He found her words both entertaining and curious. For the first time, he looked at her not just as the woman who helped with his laundry, but as someone with a past richer than her present suggested. Her story lingered in the room, painting her not as a helper, but as a woman with layers he had not considered before. Still, Ao's caution did not vanish immediately. He crossed his arms and studied her, as if trying to weigh her sincerity against his own instincts. "It's not just about cooking, Grace," he said, his voice measured. "I'm careful with food. I don't eat anyhow. Most of these vendors don't even understand hygiene. I can't risk falling sick because of what someone puts in a pot." Grace did not flinch. She stood her ground, her smile unwavering, her confidence deepening as though she had been waiting for this challenge. That's why you should trust me, Olga. I cook with my whole heart. I've been feeding people longer than you've been buying from those vendors. Let me cook one meal for you. Just one. If you don't like it, then I won't bring it up again. Her words carried a firmness that tugged at something inside him, something beyond hunger. Perhaps it was the way she spoke with assurance without arrogance, or the way her laughter seemed to fill the hollow corners of his apartment. Against his better judgment, Ao found himself nodding. All right, he said at last, his voice quieter than before. One meal. Let's see what you can do. Grace's face lit up immediately. She clapped her hands together and laughed, a laugh that seemed to chase the dust from the air. Thank you, Olga. You won't regret it. Just wait and see. She spun lightly in place, her wrapper swaying as though she had just won a small victory. In that moment, something subtle shifted in the atmosphere of the room. What had begun as an ordinary afternoon, filled with chores and fatigue, began to feel like the beginning of something neither of them fully understood. When she finally cooked for him that evening, Ao approached the meal with cautious curiosity. He sat at the small dining table, the plate before him steaming with a fragrance that teased his senses long before he tasted it. Grace stood nearby, her hands clasped, her eyes fixed on him like a student awaiting her teacher's verdict. He lifted the spoon slowly, stirred the food gently as if testing its secrets, and then took his first bite. The taste hit him like a memory he had forgotten, rich, balanced, and alive with flavor. It was not the sharp sting of pepper drowning out every other ingredient, nor the oily heaviness he had grown used to from the vendors. This was different. It was deliberate, layered, and full of care. His brows lifted, his lips parted slightly as he chewed, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a warmth that began in his stomach and spread through his chest. Grace caught the change in his face, her anticipation giving way to triumphant relief. She smiled so broadly that her dimples appeared, and she let out a soft laugh that escaped before she could stop it. Ao placed the spoon down, shook his head as if in disbelief, and chuckled. Grace, he said slowly, I didn't expect this. You can actually cook. She clapped her hands and danced a little on the spot, whispering prayers under her breath. The room suddenly felt less empty, less heavy. Even Ao noticed it. The walls that once seemed to close in on him now appeared to lean back, giving space for something lighter. That evening, he ate more than he usually did, not out of hunger, but out of genuine enjoyment. Grace's joy grew with every spoonful he took, and when he finally set the plate aside, she whispered, Thank you, Olga. Thank you so much. Ao only nodded, still amused and slightly unsettled at how quickly she had turned a simple meal into something that felt extraordinary. The days that followed their first cooking experiment unfolded like a slow river stretching across fertile land. Ao found himself adjusting to the strange new rhythm without realizing it, as if Grace's presence had filled an empty corner of his life he hadn't known existed. Every evening when he returned home, the aroma of simmering stew or sizzling vegetables greeted him even before he unlocked the door, and each time it startled him, because he had grown used to the hollow stillness of his apartment. Grace moved around the kitchen with a quiet grace, humming old songs under her breath, her laughter sometimes breaking out when she recalled something from her past. At first, Ao would sit stiffly at the dining table, watching her with the suspicion of a man who thought he had agreed to only one trial. But slowly, suspicion gave way to comfort, and comfort gave way to anticipation. He began to eat more heartily, savoring every bite, discovering that food, when prepared with care, could carry not only flavor but also a sense of peace. Grace seemed to notice this shift and allowed her joy to show, clapping her hands or spinning in little dances whenever he complimented her cooking. Though her wages were modest, she often spoke as if she had won a lottery, thanking Ao again and again for trusting her. He responded with polite nods at first, but soon, even he could not hide his amusement at her uncontainable excitement. Yet beneath the laughter and the meals, something deeper was stirring in the silence of the evenings, a bond neither of them had named, built not with grand gestures but with simple acts of care. One late afternoon, after hours of cooking and cleaning, Grace sank into a chair, her shoulders drooping, her eyes clouded with fatigue. The pots on the stove were filled with rich soups, and the table was set neatly, yet her body betrayed a weakness she could no longer mask. Ao noticed immediately, his fork pausing mid-air as he studied her face. "Are you all right, Grace?" he asked, his tone carrying genuine concern. She tried to laugh it off, but her voice wavered. "I'm fine, Olga. Just small tiredness." But the truth slipped out in her next breath. "I haven't eaten anything all day." Her words struck him harder than he expected, and for a moment he simply stared at her, the image of all those meals she had prepared flashing before him. How many times had she cooked for him while going hungry herself? Without another word he rose, filled a plate generously with the food she had just made, and set it before her. Grace hesitated, her hands trembling as though she feared to touch what was not hers. She reached for a small spoonful, but Ao shook his head firmly and took the spoon from her hand. He served her a larger portion himself, piling the plate until she gasped. "Eat," he said softly, his voice carrying both authority and kindness. Her eyes filled with tears as she knelt suddenly before him, murmuring prayers, thanking him as if he had given her the world. Embarrassed, Ao quickly helped her up, urging her to sit and eat while he stood nearby watching. As she tasted the food, relief spread across her face, and her gratitude poured out in every word, every gesture. For Ao, the moment was unexpectedly powerful. He felt something break open inside him, a tenderness he had not allowed himself to feel for anyone in years. That night, when he finally lay down to sleep, his heart felt lighter, as though her tears had washed away a heaviness he did not know he carried. The following weeks revealed a new pattern. Grace continued to cook and clean with her usual enthusiasm, but now Ao made it a habit to ensure she ate from whatever she prepared. At first, she resisted, insisting that the food belonged to him, but his insistence wore down her protests, and soon it became a silent agreement between them. More than once, Ao found himself standing in the kitchen beside her, watching as she dished a plate for herself, his lips curving into a smile he didn't even notice forming. Sometimes he would tease her about the size of her portion, and she would laugh shyly, pretending to be offended while secretly enjoying the banter. In moments like those, the apartment felt alive in ways it never had before. The clatter of pots, the hiss of frying oil, the rhythm of chopping vegetables, all these sounds became a background music that soothed Ao after long days at work. He also began to surprise her with small gestures, an envelope with a little extra cash tucked inside, a transfer of 5,000 naira after a particularly tiring day, sometimes even 10 when he felt she needed it more. Each time, Grace reacted with disbelief, her eyes wide, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to thank him. She often prayed for him aloud, calling blessings into his life with such intensity that Ao found himself chuckling, though inwardly her prayers touched him more deeply than he admitted. Her presence no longer felt like that of a hired hand. It felt like companionship, something warmer and more personal. The walls of his apartment, once oppressive, now carried echoes of laughter and the faint rhythm of hope. Yet even in the midst of this new comfort, Ao sometimes found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling and questioning the path he was on. He reminded himself constantly that Grace was a married woman, that her devotion to cooking and her gratitude for his kindness should not be mistaken for anything else. But the human heart is a tricky place, and his thoughts often wandered despite his efforts to keep them steady. He recalled her kneeling with tears in her eyes, the way she hugged him after he gave her extra money, the way her face glowed when he praised her cooking. These memories lingered, refusing to dissolve, pulling at him with a mixture of tenderness and unease. He told himself it was simple, he was just helping someone in need, and she was showing her appreciation. Nothing more. Yet as he drifted toward sleep, her laughter would echo faintly in his mind, and he would smile before quickly scolding himself. The next morning, when he returned to the rhythm of work, he tried to bury those thoughts beneath reports, meetings, and deadlines. But every evening when he walked through the door and was greeted by the familiar aroma of Grace's cooking, the questions returned. What exactly had they built between them? Was it only kindness? Was it friendship? Or was it something more dangerous, something neither of them had dared to name? For now, the answers remained hidden, locked behind the ordinary rhythm of meals and laughter, waiting for a day when the silence would break and reveal truths Ao had never intended to uncover. The weekend that altered the steady rhythm of Ao's quiet life began like any other, with the heat of Abadan pressing down and the restless noise of the city filtering through his windows. He had been seeing a young woman named Miriam for some time, a vibrant lady with a voice that always carried laughter in its undertones and a spirit that seemed untouched by worry. She was different from Grace in every possible way. Her perfume lingered long after she walked through a room, her nails were polished, and she often spoke of dreams that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the present. Ao had invited her to spend a few days at his apartment, eager to enjoy companionship of a kind that went beyond the soft comfort of meals and the prayers of gratitude. Miriam arrived on a Friday evening, her suitcase rolling across the floor as she examined the space with curious eyes. She complimented the orderliness of the place, unaware that it was not Ao's doing but Grace's diligent hands that had given the apartment its neatness. They cooked noodles together that night, a simple meal that carried more laughter than flavor, and Ao found himself watching her in a way he had not watched anyone in years. The closeness felt refreshing, a reminder that his life could hold more than work and weariness. Yet, even in that moment of tender joy, the shadow of Grace's inevitable arrival lingered in the back of his mind, like the warning toll of a distant bell he chose to ignore. He reassured himself she would come, do her work, and leave as she always did, without stepping across boundaries that did not belong to her. But sometimes life does not follow the neat paths we draw in our imagination, and fate delights in scattering pieces that shatter carefully arranged peace. When Grace arrived the next morning, the shift in her demeanor was almost immediate, though she tried to mask it behind polite greetings. She stepped into the apartment with her usual basket of supplies, but as soon as her eyes met Miriam's, her smile faltered and vanished, like a candle snuffed out by a sudden breeze. She murmured a greeting, her tone stripped of its usual warmth, and went straight to her tasks without waiting for a response. Ao, sensing the tension, tried to ease it with casual conversation, but Grace's answers were clipped, her movements sharp, and her silence heavier than the clatter of pots. Miriam, quick to notice such things, whispered to Ao later, "Your maid doesn't seem happy to see me." The remark stung him because it was true, but he brushed it off with a forced laugh, pretending it was nothing more than fatigue on Grace's part. Still, he could not ignore the half-hearted way she dusted the shelves, the careless strokes of her mop, or the stew that tasted slightly off, as though cooked with irritation instead of care. Miriam excused herself at one point, choosing to visit a friend in the neighborhood, rather than sit under the weight of Grace's quiet hostility. Her absence left the apartment feeling even more tense, as though the air itself was aware of the storm that was slowly gathering. Ao watched Grace as she scrubbed the kitchen counter with unnecessary force, and in that moment, he realized he had underestimated the depth of whatever bond had formed between them. It was no longer just about meals and wages. Something unseen had taken root in Grace's heart, and it was beginning to show in ways that unsettled him deeply. Later that evening, when Grace finally announced she was done with her chores, Ao asked her to sit for a moment, hoping to understand what had gone wrong. He expected her to complain about exhaustion or wages, perhaps even about the inconvenience of his guest. Instead, her face flushed, her eyes burned, and she blurted out words that froze him where he stood. "No, Olga, everything is not all right. Who is that small girl you brought into our house?" The phrase "our house" struck him with the force of thunder, echoing in his chest and leaving him momentarily speechless. He stammered in confusion, "She's my girlfriend." "Why are you asking?" Grace's voice cracked with pain and anger. "So you have a girlfriend, and she cannot cook for you? She cannot clean for you? After everything we share, after all the food and the moments, you bring another woman here?" Her accusations left Ao trembling, as though the ground beneath him had tilted. He shook his head in disbelief. "I don't understand, Grace. What do you mean after everything? You're a married woman with children." His words were almost a plea, begging for sense where none could be found. But Grace's expression only hardened, her voice rising with a mixture of heartbreak and rage. "I thought you liked me, Olga. I thought you loved me. Don't tell me you didn't feel anything after all the times we shared food, after all the kindness, after all the prayers. Don't tell me it meant nothing." Ao's throat tightened. He wanted to shout back, to remind her of boundaries, but all he could do was whisper, "Grace, please, don't do this." Yet her emotions had spilled too far to be gathered back, and the room was filled with a storm neither of them could control. Her final outburst carried the weight of betrayal and wounded pride. "You think I am hungry for your food?" She spat, her words slicing the air like sharp blades. "Keep your food for you and your new girl. Both of you can eat it together." "I am not starving, Olga." She hissed long and loud, a sound that seemed to coil around his heart like a snake, and then she grabbed her things and stormed toward the door. Her footsteps struck the floor like angry drums, and before Ao could gather his thoughts, the door slammed so violently the walls trembled. He stood frozen, staring at the space she had left behind, the pot still warm on the stove, the smell of stew lingering like smoke after a fire. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, his mind caught between anger, disbelief, and fear. The apartment felt smaller, suffocating, as though Grace had taken with her not just her belongings, but also the fragile balance that had existed in his life. Alone in the silence, Ao walked to the kitchen, lifted the lids off the pots, and without hesitation dumped their contents into the bin. The sight of the food turned his stomach, transforming what once brought comfort into a symbol of betrayal. By the time Miriam returned, he had already sat down, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared himself to explain what had happened. But deep within, he knew that nothing he said would restore what had already begun to unravel, because once trust is shaken and emotions spill over, no explanation can sew back the torn fabric of peace. The silence after Grace's departure was thick enough to choke. Ao sat in the middle of his apartment, his body still trembling, the echo of her hiss still ringing in his ears like a curse he could not shake off. He tried to calm his breathing, but every inhale carried the bitter scent of the food she had cooked, and it made his stomach twist with disgust. The pots, now empty and discarded in the bin, seemed to mock him, reminders of what had just transpired. He pressed his palms to his face, dragging them down slowly as though trying to peel away the memory. Nothing made sense to him. How had simple kindness grown into such a monstrous misunderstanding? He replayed her words in his mind. "Our house. I thought you loved me." Phrases that clung to his skin like oil that refused to wash off. His thoughts were a storm, colliding with each other, breaking against the walls of his mind. He had wanted to help, to ease her burden, but now he wondered if generosity had been a mistake, if perhaps he had unknowingly invited chaos into his life by crossing boundaries that should have remained untouched. The slam of the door still haunted him. It wasn't just the sound of someone leaving, it was the sound of trust collapsing, of companionship curdling into bitterness. He stood up suddenly, pacing the room, as though movement could shake off the weight pressing down on him. Yet each step only deepened his unease. Each thought brought him back to the same point. He had lost control of something he never even realized he was holding. When Miriam returned that evening, the weariness on her face suggested she had hoped for a calmer home than the one she left behind. But as soon as she saw the state of Ao, the slump in his shoulders, the dampness in his eyes, the way he avoided her gaze, she sensed that something had unraveled in her absence. "What happened?" she asked softly, setting her bag down on the chair. Ao hesitated, struggling to find words, because every version of the story sounded unbelievable even to his own ears. Yet he began to explain, his voice low, recounting the confrontation, the accusations, the fury, the words Grace had thrown like daggers. He spoke of how she claimed love, how she spoke as though the house belonged to them both, how she left in anger and humiliation. Miriam listened, but as the tale stretched, her eyes narrowed, her expression shifting from sympathy to suspicion. She folded her arms across her chest and leaned against the wall, her silence sharper than any interruption. When Ao finally fell quiet, exhausted from retelling what already tormented him, Miriam let out a bitter laugh. "If you weren't sleeping with her, she wouldn't act that way," she said bluntly. The words struck him harder than Grace's outburst. He shook his head, his hands rising in protest. "No, Miriam, it's not like that. I never crossed that line. I only helped her, that's all." She misread it. But Miriam's expression did not soften. Her eyes darted around the apartment as if searching for hidden evidence, as if every corner of the room might reveal the truth of her suspicions. "Do you take me for a fool?" she asked, her tone colder than the night air. "You expect me to believe that a married woman would throw herself at you over plates of food and small money? You think I don't know what goes on when I'm not here?" Ao's heart sank as he realized her trust had been fractured by shadows he could not dispel. The argument grew heavier with each passing second, the apartment shrinking under the weight of accusations and denials. Ao's voice rose, desperate, pleading for her to see reason, to understand that he had never intended for things to spiral out of control. But Miriam's voice cut through his like a whip, sharp and unforgiving. "You allowed her into your life, into your home, into your kitchen. Do you know how that looks? Do you know what people will say if they hear this story? You might claim nothing happened, but the way she spoke, the way she reacted, it tells me everything I need to know." Ao ran his hands over his head, pulling at his hair, his chest heaving with frustration. He felt trapped in a nightmare where truth had no voice, where perception was stronger than reality. Miriam began gathering her belongings, her movements brisk and final, each fold of clothing into her bag, sounding like a hammer striking nails into a coffin. Ao tried to stop her, reaching for her wrist, but she pulled away as though his touch burned. "I will not compete with a woman old enough to be my mother, married or not," she said firmly, zipping her bag with finality. "Whatever this is between you and her, you can keep it. I'm done." The words shattered him. His knees weakened. and for a moment he thought he might collapse onto the floor. He wanted to scream, to beg her to stay, but his pride held his mouth shut, and his despair swallowed the rest. When the door closed behind Miriam, softer than Grace's slam but heavier in its finality, Ao sank onto the couch and buried his face in his hands. The apartment, once filled with laughter, aromas, and echoes of life, now felt like a tomb. The shadows pressed against him, the silence louder than any noise he had ever endured. He tried to retrace his steps, to find the exact moment where kindness turned into ruin, but every path led to the same place, a heart heavy with regret. Grace was gone, leaving behind confusion and betrayal. Miriam was gone, leaving behind suspicion and loss. All he had now was the echo of their absence, ringing in the hollow chambers of his life. The meals that once filled his evenings with comfort had become symbols of destruction. The laughter that once chased away silence had twisted into the sound of doors slamming shut. Alone in the dim light, he whispered to himself, "How did it come to this?" But no answer came, only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft beating of his own broken heart. In that moment, he realized he had not just lost two women. He had lost the fragile balance he thought he had found, the illusion of warmth that had briefly lit his lonely life. And as the night stretched endlessly before him, he understood that some mistakes do not announce themselves loudly. They slip in quietly, wearing the mask of kindness, until they leave you staring at ruins you never meant to build. The weeks that followed Miriam's departure blurred into one another, each day stretching long and heavy like the unbroken line of a horizon seen through dusty glass. Ao moved through his routines mechanically, but the color of life seemed to have drained out of the world around him. The apartment, once filled with the smell of simmering stew and the light chatter of Grace's laughter, had fallen into a silence so complete it seemed to breathe. Every time he stepped into the kitchen, his eyes betrayed him, recalling images of her bustling presence, her hands cutting vegetables with practiced speed, her humming turning the mundane into something almost comforting. He would stand in front of the empty counter, staring at utensils that looked abandoned, and for a fleeting moment he almost expected her to appear, wiping her hands on her wrapper and asking him what soup he preferred that day. But she never came, and the emptiness pressed down harder. On some nights, when he returned from work, the loneliness was so sharp that it felt like a physical wound. He tried to cook for himself, but his efforts were clumsy. Overcooked rice, watery stew, eggs that tasted of nothing but salt. Each failed attempt mocked him, reminding him that the taste of care could not be replicated by tired hands. He ended up throwing most of it away, retreating to biscuits or bread, food that required no effort, no memory, no heart. The silence of his apartment grew louder with every passing day, and though no one else could see it, Ao felt as if the walls were closing in on him, carrying whispers of all that had slipped through his fingers. He avoided people more than ever, reluctant to answer questions he feared might expose the turmoil inside him. At work, he buried himself in files and deadlines, hoping to outrun the ache that clung to him like a stubborn shadow. His colleagues teased him about how withdrawn he had become, how he no longer joined them for even the simplest office banter, but he forced smiles that never reached his eyes. He knew they could not understand. How could they, when he himself could barely make sense of it? In the evenings, he sometimes sat by his window overlooking the street, watching life unfold below. Children ran after tires, their laughter carrying the kind of innocence that no heartbreak could touch. Women called out prices of vegetables in the market stalls, their voices sharp and alive, each syllable brimming with survival. Men gathered by beer parlors, arguing about politics and football as if the fate of the world hung on their words. Life continued with its chaotic rhythm, but Ao remained apart from it, an observer who had lost his place in the dance. He envied the noise, the ease, the energy of those who seemed untouched by betrayal or suspicion. At times, he wondered if he had been foolish to let Grace so deeply into his daily life, to blur the line between employer and helper. Yet even in his anger, memories of her gratitude, her tears, and her prayers haunted him. He could not hate her, no matter how much he wanted to. What unsettled him most was the way Miriam's departure had sealed his loneliness. He had hoped that even if Grace was gone, Miriam's laughter would still fill the void, but her absence carved a hole so deep that nothing seemed capable of filling it. He had lost them both, and in losing them, he had lost something of himself. Gradually, Ao began to settle into a new pattern, though it was born not of choice but of necessity. He cooked only when hunger twisted his stomach so fiercely that he could not ignore it. His meals became stripped of variety, yam boiled in salted water, plain noodles, rice eaten with whatever sauce he could throw together. He learned to wash his own clothes, to sweep the floor and wipe the counters, not because he wanted to but because no one else would. These tasks were done without care, just enough to keep the apartment from descending into filth, but never enough to restore the warmth it once held. He no longer entertained visitors, and soon people stopped knocking at his door altogether. The phone calls from friends grew fewer, replaced by long stretches of silence, broken only by the occasional vibration of work-related messages. In those moments, he felt the full weight of isolation, the price of kindness misunderstood and companionship lost. Sometimes he considered hiring another woman to cook or clean, but the thought alone filled him with dread. He remembered the storm Grace had unleashed, the suspicion in Miriam's eyes, and he decided it was safer to endure loneliness than to risk another entanglement. His life narrowed again, shrinking into the same cycle of work and solitude he had known before Grace, only now it felt heavier, tainted by the ghost of what once was. The laughter that had briefly lit his apartment had been extinguished, and in its place remained a silence so deep that even the sound of his own breathing felt intrusive. Yet in that silence, Ao learned a bitter truth about himself and the choices he had made. One evening, as he sat alone at his small dining table, staring at a plate of rice that had already gone cold, he realized that the emptiness he felt was not only about the women who had left, but also about the illusions he had built in his mind. He had mistaken gratitude for affection, kindness for intimacy, and in doing so, he had wandered into a space where no one truly belonged. Grace had taken his generosity and woven it into a fantasy of love, while Miriam had taken Grace's outburst as evidence of betrayal. Both had walked away, but the fault lines had begun in his own decisions. He had blurred lines that should have remained sharp, opened doors without checking what lay beyond them. That night, as he chewed the tasteless rice, he whispered to himself, "Not every act of kindness is safe." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, echoing against the quiet walls. He finished his meal slowly, each bite reminding him of the lessons etched into his life by the storm he had endured. The city outside continued to hum, unaware of the man sitting in solitude within its heart, but for Ao, Ibadan would never sound the same again. In the stillness of his apartment, with only the dim light casting long shadows on the wall, he accepted what he had come to know. Sometimes kindness does not build bridges, it builds walls, and behind those walls, a man can find himself more alone than he ever imagined. My dear listeners, you have heard this story of Ao, how simple kindness turned into a storm that scattered peace. The lesson is clear: not every open door is safe to walk through, and not every smiling face means what it shows. In life, we must give with wisdom and love with clarity, so that our goodness is not mistaken and our peace is not stolen. And now, I pray for you. May your acts of kindness never become the source of your sorrow. May the works of your hands bring you honor and not disgrace. May your heart find true companions who cherish you sincerely. May your home be filled with laughter that no betrayal can silence. May you never lose your joy to false intentions. And may the blessings of wisdom, peace, and love surround you wherever you go. If you believe it, let me hear you say a loud and joyful amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.